9-year-old Nabila Riemann and her older brother Zubar say they were picking okra with their grandmother to get ready for a holiday last October. Their home is in a remote part of Pakistan. Around 3 in the afternoon, Zubar says the skies darkened and a drone fired on their house. He said when the drone fired the first time, the whole ground shook and black smoke rose up. The children ran before the second missile came down, but their grandmother was killed. Little Nabla had a wound to her hand that wouldn't stop bleeding, and Zubar needed 2 surgeries to remove shrapnel from his legs. Zubar says he doesn't play outdoor games with his cousins anymore because they're too scared. America's use of armed drones as a war weapon began under former President George W. Bush, but greatly accelerated under former President Barack Obama. They saw the unmanned robotic aircraft as an ideal way of killing enemies in remote parts of the world without having to send in ground forces on a risky mission. Bush used armed drones mostly in Pakistan. Obama has deployed them in Yemen, Libya, and Somalia, with at least 6 American citizens among the many hundreds killed. And Obama built up a network of about a dozen drone bases around the world from Niger to Kuwait. Obama has promised more transparency concerning U.S. drone strikes. He promised that in May of 2013, and the White House at that time made it seem like there would be a major shift away from the perpetual secret war against terrorism. However, that shift never materialized, and important parts of the drone program, including who makes the call to kill individual militants and using what criteria, all that remains classified. While the number of strikes declined in Pakistan and Yemen, the tactic remained a pillar of Obama's counterterrorism strategy. Administration officials regularly insist that the U.S. drone program is an effective tool that's more precise than using ground troops or larger scale bombing with manned aircraft. And if you look at the number of U.S. troops killed in action, you can see by the numbers alone, drone strikes actually lower U.S. casualties substantially. The total of U.S. American casualties under George W. Bush's presidency was 4,861 U.S. troops. President Bush was the one who began the use of drones, and he used them about 50 times. Under President Obama's watch, as of February of 2016, there had been roughly 500 strikes. At the end of President Obama's last term, the U.S. forces had only lost 2,052 troops. The difference between 4,861 losses compared to 2,052 losses is substantial, and it is largely due to drones. Critics argue that the administration needed to go public with the criteria that's used to decide what militants get targeted. And some critics, both Democrats and Republicans, say the United States would be better served capturing and interrogating militants rather than simply killing them from above. I question that in light of the Guantanamo scandal. How well the strikes are performed and the quality of the intelligence behind them has also been criticized a lot in recent years. A raid in 2015 killed a missing U.S. aid worker named Warren Weinstein and his Italian colleague, both of whom were being held hostage by Al-Qaeda in Pakistan. U.S. intelligence agencies didn't even know the hostages were at the site, and it took them weeks to come clean about their deaths. The number of civilians killed or wounded in the strikes has also generated a lot of controversy. There are concerns that the operations create more violent extremism that gets directed at the United States. The Obama administration insisted that only a small number of civilians are inadvertently killed in drone strikes. Independent estimates from several different authorities have put the number in the hundreds, ranging from about 300 to 900 between 2004 and 2014. The defense and intelligence communities defend drones as effective anti-terrorism tools. They are accepted by some U.S. allies and even in the public opinion because they lead to lower casualties. However, concerns over the legality and ultimately the ethics of lethal U.S. drone strikes are very real. Some analysts say that the U.S. should establish international controls on drones that could be created by looking at past globally universal agreements on ballistic missiles. In the middle of all this, one of the biggest barriers to U.S. leadership on an agreement like this is internal, coming from the executive and the legislative branches of our own government. The Obama administration's stance on drone use was similar to that of the Bush administration and shows how the executive branch, both Republican and Democrat, will fight to maintain that flexibility when it comes to the use of force. Drones are just the most recent example of that long-term strategic trend. Also, the U.S. Senate has been really reluctant to engage in treaties or international agreements in a lot of areas, from non-military topics like climate change all the way to strategic ones like maritime laws. For the U.S. to lead the rest of the world on drone standards, probably the White House would not only have to give up some of its own say over their use, but they'd really have to work to convince Congress of the need for international controls. The use of lethal force is the most powerful action a state can take against a person. In a democracy, those types of policies need to be out in the open. How else can we know if they're lawful or justified? How else can we know what's being done in our name? It's been said that the use of drones outside of areas of armed conflicts, it devastates communities, it fuels recruitment to the very terrorists, and the drones are meant to target those terrorists. Terrorist organizations really work that fear of drones and the resentment caused by civilians who get killed. Government officials say that the bombs are targeted at only terrorists. Former soldiers have spoken about how close they have come to inadvertently shooting a civilian during an armed conflict and insist that it's really hard to make that type of call from a few hundred feet and that it's really impossible from a few thousand feet. President Trump is looking to approve a new drone strike policy recommended to him by his senior national security team. The reported new Principles, Standards, and Procedures document, which would replace President Obama's presidential policy guidance as policy guidelines, looks to streamline the bureaucratic review process and change the high threshold for the use of force adopted by former President Obama. Now, in a big about-face from Trump's tough talk that included the promises to kill civilian family members of terrorists, the new guidance actually keeps the Obama-era objective to take the utmost care to prevent civilian casualties. More details are needed to fully assess how good and efficient the new policy will be, but there are some significant points seen based on what's now publicly available. First, the fact that the president is replacing Obama's policy with another document that's similar is a huge vindication of the former president's approach to overseeing drone operations. It also shows how much that approach has been institutionalized by career counterterrorism professionals. President Trump's team could have just as easily recommended that he cancel the guidance and govern operations through a patchwork of policies that would apply different standards to different locations. Instead, Trump kept Obama's approach using the same standards that are used in conventional battlefields. Second, the new document also establishes that preventing civilian casualties is a moral imperative. It is also essential to a range of strategic objectives, including getting our partner governments on board with us, making sure of local support or at least tolerance for what we're doing, and preventing terrorists from using the whole civilian casualties thing as a rallying cry. In this policy, we see that what the counterterrorism community has long known about civilian protection, and we see that it's now going to be standard policy. The biggest departure from Obama's policy is doing away with something called the threat threshold, and that must be met before lethal action can be taken. Under the old policy, lethal action can be taken only against terrorist targets that pose a continuing imminent threat to U.S. persons. This requirement is taken away under the new guidance. The new policy will allow for strikes against those characterized as foot soldier jihadists that don't have any unique skills or leadership roles. The removal of the continuing imminent threat standard is a problem for those who think that U.S. policy should come closer to international human rights laws. In those laws, lethal action can only be taken when the threat is imminent or it can't be handled by any other means. The problem with the continuing imminent threat standard is that it often conflicts with best practices for targeting terrorist networks. In over 16 years of operations, our counterterrorism professionals have become really good at analyzing the structure of terrorist networks and targeting them based on the understanding that there are particular nodes that if you could remove that part of the terrorist organization, that could bring down the entire network. In a lot of cases, those particular operatives and terrorist organizations may be couriers or bodyguards or propagandists. These are the types of people who are lawful military targets under the laws of war, but they don't pose an imminent threat to the U.S. people. The new policy would give operators greater leeway to target according to what would be considered more effective in disrupting and defeating terrorist networks. All of this reflects a big shift in how war is conducted. International law professors John Yu of the University of California, Berkeley, and Jeremy Rabkin of George Mason University have written a new book called Striking Power: How Cyber, Robots, and Space Weapons Change the Rules of War. If you think about the way Facebook, Google, and Amazon use artificial intelligence to learn about you and effectively market directly to you, you're becoming more of a market of one instead of a plebe in the mass market. The more technology can customize products, the more we'll demand products built just for each of us, not mass-produced stuff made for everybody. In the military, this hyper-targeting is exactly what drones are about. Instead of leveling a village like the U.S. did in Vietnam, we build one robotic flying machine to seek out and kill a targeted individual. The authors point out that the Obama administration deployed a software virus called Stuxnet in 2010 to disrupt Iran's nuclear weapons program, but do no other damage. The authors suggest that the U.S. should go on the offensive with cyber weapons designed to do things like make a missile malfunction or erase data from military computers or wipe out a country's bank account or even steal and publicize top leader emails. It might send out tiny, barely detectable AI-driven drones that would work together like swarms of bees to take out key assets or people. In the longer run, it's feasible to develop satellite-based anti-missile technology armed with AI that could watch over a nation, learn what an impending missile strike would look like, and immediately fry the thing with lasers. New technology gives countries more options than just old-fashioned blunt trauma warfare. Yes, we need to know what the government is doing. But in the face of a security threat, we also need to not be afraid to use the sophisticated weapons we currently have and work towards more sophistication in the future.